So one of the big myths about raising the minimum wage is that if you did, this would disproportionately impact small business owners, that they would bear the brunt of this, where bigger corporations like Walmart or McDonald's, they could afford to pay their employees more than $7 an hour, whereas, mom and pop shops, they couldn't afford to do that. That is actually a myth, and if you make the argument that raising the minimum wage to $15 would just overall impact small businesses, a blanket decrease in their productivity, the jobs that they offer. Number one, there is no proof that overwhelmingly small businesses are impacted by minimum wages like that. It's just not there. When you talk about small businesses, that's a very varied term. That can be how we define a small business. Number one is a problem. A small business could be a small factory, right? It doesn't have to be like a little grocery store or anything like that. So that's the first thing about the myth. You have to break out of this idea that small business means like a small pizza shop or something like that, right? There are different definitions of that. The other thing is that these are all choices. Small business owners, they do make choices. The minimum wage obviously has increased a lot, since the 1930s when it was 25 cents an hour. But small businesses continue to operate. There are lots of other factors for why small businesses suffer during certain times of economic problems or economic distress. Most have little to do with the fact that they have to pay their employees a certain number or a certain amount of wages. More often than not, it's things like, rental costs. What does it cost to rent your property? Operational costs. These are things that are within the control of a small business owner. It's not an either-or situation where just because the minimum wage increases, that means they have to automatically fire their employees, right? I mean, this is not an all-or-nothing sort of game. And in fact, if you look at places, and there are studies that have been done on this in cities like Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco, a lot of small business owners will say, employee salaries, wages, that's the least of their concerns. They're more concerned about rental prices. That makes up most of their operating costs, not what they pay their employees. So in fact, in places like Seattle, when the minimum wage increases, or places like Los Angeles or San Francisco, business owners aren't concerned about wages. They're more than happy to pay the increase in minimum wage. What they want is to actually decrease other operating costs. So no, overall speaking, the minimum wage raising to $15 an hour does not automatically equate into people losing their jobs or small businesses going under. Running a small business is a risk, and you have to assume all those risks. And raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour does not mean that a business will automatically tank. So one of the examples that you could turn to more recently to look at how the minimum wage increase has affected things like job rates or unemployment, a lot of people have been looking at Seattle, which recently increased its minimum wage, and a lot of the job losses that happen to be in the restaurant industry. This is a very problematic argument to make if you are trying to argue that we should not raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. First of all, in a very general way, again, there are choices that businesses make. There's almost, because of a lot of the political baggage that is attached to the minimum wage law, there are ready-made excuses for business owners to say, I need to cut operational costs because the minimum wage increased. Therefore, I have to let my employees go. That's a choice that someone makes. It's not a given. It doesn't have to happen like that. There are other operational costs that go into the bigger picture. So it gets a little hard to use that as a specific example for why you should not increase the minimum wage. A lot of individuals on both sides of the political spectrum, but those who are against the minimum wage, a lot of conservatives are against raising the minimum wage. They treat this as a very simple game, where they like to argue that it's total economic common sense. You increase the minimum wage, that means people need to pay their employees more. That means they're not going to make as much money. That means they're going to go under. And it's not often as simple as that. It's just the problem is that this idea of paying people a minimum wage so that they can basically try and live has become very politicized. And so it is very difficult to use just one argument either for or against it. But in a lot of cases, using the Seattle example as an argument against increasing the minimum wage is very problematic. It's very one-sided. Things are not always black and white, and the same thing goes with the minimum wage. Just because there has been this impact in this one sector of Seattle does not mean that it's going to have the same impact nationwide. And in fact, there are plenty of other instances where an increase in the minimum wage has not drastically affected levels of unemployment or caused businesses to go under. So another argument that people use against raising the minimum wage would be that just by simply increasing the minimum wage would lead to inflation. The first thing about that is if you make that argument, you're not understanding just how complex inflation is. Inflation is never simply about wages increasing and then automatically that means prices increase. That's a very narrow-minded understanding of how economics, the economy, and inflation actually operates. There are multiple causes for inflation. Number one, if you look at American history, there are periods of runaway inflation. In the 1970s, for example, stagflation, where our rate of inflation countered with a very high level of unemployment. None of that had anything to do with the increase in minimum wage. There has never been a direct connection between if the minimum wage is increased, that means prices will automatically increase, and that means the minimum wage is pointless. Again, there's really no direct correlation to that. Inflation in minor quantities is actually the result of a pretty healthy economy. It's when it goes crazy, that's when you have to worry. But there's no proof that at any point in American history, raising the minimum wage laws has actually led to a drastic increase in prices. And so to sort of switch over to another side of the inflation argument, the argument that prices would drastically increase is also not very relevant. In fact, in other studies that have been done, the rate of increase in prices for different goods is far, far less than the actual, rate of the increase of the minimum wage. So it won't cancel anything out. It doesn't mean that just because someone gets paid more that it's totally pointless because prices are going to raise. That's not true. That's not how inflation works. And you're also, not looking at places where prices might go up if they go up at all. Again, it's not across the board. To use an example again about fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, the increase in prices for different food products was maybe 0.04%. That's a lot less than the 10% increase in wages. So it's not drastic. It won't kill the economy. Tying the minimum wage to inflation is not a very good argument. Whether you're for or against it, but if you're going to use that as an argument for why you shouldn't increase the minimum wage, there needs to be a little bit more study done there because there's not a direct correlation to that. Another myth that people will use when they try and argue against raising the minimum wage is that raising the minimum wage will automatically equate into a loss of jobs. So there is the argument that unemployment will increase if you increase the minimum wage. That is, again, also a very faulty understanding of impact, cause, and effect of economics. Traditionally speaking, if you look at the federal level, so if you take the federal unemployment level over, let's say the 1930s when we have our first standard minimum wage laws, the minimum wage does not directly result, raising the minimum wage has never directly resulted in a dip or an increase in unemployment. So federally speaking, across the board, there has never been really any evidence that raising the minimum wage has a direct effect on an increase in unemployment. Again, you can look at places like Seattle, where this newly increased minimum wage, you've seen some loss in jobs in the restaurant industry, but that's one sector, right? I mean, that's one area of the economy, that's one state, that's one city, and this is a relatively new thing. I mean, it was only recently enacted. But if you look at the federal level, if that's what we're talking about, federally raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, there's no evidence that alone will contribute to unemployment, an increase in unemployment, or massive, massive job losses. Most of the people who would be impacted by an increase in minimum wage would be a lot of the bigger corporations or their franchisees who employ many, many people. And again, there's little evidence that this will directly affect unemployment at the aggregate level. So another really big myth that surrounds the idea of increasing the minimum wage is that we shouldn't do it because the only people who work in minimum wage jobs are teenagers, single young people, that basically they form the majority of minimum wage workers. That is definitely not true, and that has never been true in American history. I mean, are there teenagers who work minimum wage jobs? Yes, of course. However, there are plenty of people who are trying to support their families living off of minimum wage. Single mothers, single parents, you know, teenagers who might have to care for themselves or care for others, but a minimum wage job is not solely the domain of young people or unattached people or college students or high school students. This is kind of the same argument that we would make fun of today, whereas back in the day, people argued that women who worked outside of the home in like the early 1900s, they all had husbands to care for them, so we shouldn't pay women you know, more than the bare minimum because they're not supporting families. And that's absolutely false. I mean, for in all periods of American history, women worked not just to contribute to a family income, but in a lot of cases, they did have to work and try and feed their family off of the bare minimum that they're making. So that's that argument that we would think is very silly today. That's the same type of argument that people are making when they say that the only people who would benefit from an increase in the minimum wage are teenagers. That's absolutely not true at all. And again, if you think about past arguments, it's no different. You have no proof that the only people that would benefit would be teenagers. There are, again, plenty of people who are trying to make a life, build a life, care for their families when they're only making $7.25 an hour, which it's impossible to live off of that without other forms of social safety nets or different forms of support. Another sort of myth surrounding this debate over should we or should we not raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour is the idea that if you give people more than $7.25 an hour, somehow they won't want to work harder, or they won't want to try and improve or move up. And again, that's a very unfounded argument. I mean, I'm trying to think of, there's no proof actually that will happen. That's a cultural assumption, and it's very incorrect, and it's actually pretty offensive, because that's assuming that people who are working minimum wage jobs might not have any motivation to want to better themselves beyond that job, and we all know that's true. There are plenty of college students who work in minimum wage jobs. There are plenty of people, you know, single parents who have to go back to school or whatever. But this idea that just because you're in a minimum wage job and someone gives you $15 an hour, that all of a sudden you're going to stop trying to move up, or, you know, even moving up within the corporate structure that you work for, is just, it's not true. There's no real proof for that. There's a lot of cultural baggage there that people are assuming about individuals who work in minimum wage jobs. Plus, $15 an hour is a significant improvement from $7.25 an hour, but that's still not a lot. I mean, people are still going to want to try and improve themselves and work harder. So it's this idea that somehow if you give a McDonald's worker $15 an hour, that means that they're suddenly going to stop working, there's no evidence or proof for that. That's a cultural assumption that is really largely unfounded. Another argument against raising the minimum wage is that people who work in minimum wage jobs, just by the very nature of the work they do, somehow don't deserve to make $15 an hour, that they're doing kind of silly, unuseful totally irrelevant work that has no impact on society, whatever. So again, to point to one of the best examples that people often use, they'll try and make the argument by using fast food workers. And they'll say, do these people really deserve to make $15 an hour for the work that they do? Again, there's a lot of problems in that. That's not a very good argument because you're not actually using any facts or anything of that nature. You would be relying on your own assumptions, and you're assuming that somehow people who work minimum wage jobs don't deserve to have a livable wage. That somehow that's a job that's undeserving of any sort of income security or safety, or that people who work in minimum wage jobs don't deserve to be able to support their families, and that everyone should, if you're working at McDonald's, it's because you deserve to be there and you don't have any motivation to do anything better. Obviously that's not true, because plenty of people who go to college have to work minimum wage jobs, and they definitely do want to do better, but that doesn't mean that they should have to live at poverty levels while they're doing this. Single parents, people who might live in towns where there aren't many options. Across the South, industry has been fleeing. There's not a lot of industrial jobs like there might have been 15, 20, 30 years ago, where it was possible to get out of high school and get a good job right away. Now in small southern towns, working at minimum wage jobs might be the only thing that's available. That might be the only job, and people don't necessarily have the means to be able to move. So just because people are bound by certain circumstances and do a particular type of labor doesn't mean that they should not be able to live or make a livable wage based on the type of work that they do. That's a very dangerous and often offensive assumption to make, that someone's worth is tied automatically to the type of labor that they do, rather than the fact that they're a human being and they live in this country and they deserve to be able to eat and pay their bills and other things of that nature. Another interesting thing about the debate over raising or not the minimum wage, and something that kind of gets overlooked, is trying to keep pace between wages and prices increasing. So we already know that just because you raise wages doesn't necessarily mean that prices automatically increase. We can look at the idea that the minimum wage has really not been adjusted to deal with a lot of the inflated prices, over the years. $7.25 is not a lot. It's not a lot of purchasing power considering where prices are today. And it's very interesting because they're actually, on a yearly basis, depending on what different industry or what state you're in, there have been wage increases. If you look at cost of living adjustments, for example. So these are, small raises that different salaried employees get, for example. Here at Valdosta State University, faculty, I believe a few years back, received a cost of living adjustment. That's meant to ensure that our purchasing power stays at a good pace with the increase in prices. So the assumption is that the cost of living is going to increase, and that people need a little bit of a pay increase to keep pace with that. That's really not any different than the idea of increasing the minimum wage. It's the same idea. We're trying to adjust for cost of living. But somehow when you talk about increasing the minimum wage, people get very, very angry about that. Meanwhile, many of us benefit from an increase in our wages through cost of living adjustments. So they're really not very different, but it just goes back to that assumption that when you say minimum wage, people automatically think of individuals, who might be working in low-paying jobs because they can't do any better, or they're only teenagers. Whereas cost of living adjustment, there's some more cultural baggage there where people associate that with salaried employees, so people who might have bachelor's or master's or even PhDs. But they're essentially kind of the same thing. It's just, again, people have a lot of different assumptions that makes them more prone to be against increasing the minimum wage, but really have no opinion whatsoever on cost of living adjustment. Or these are individuals who might get angry if they don't have a cost of living adjustment or COLA, and they're the first in line to protest against increasing the minimum wage. So there is a discrepancy there in our society in terms of how we define what a minimum wage is and who's entitled to a minimum wage. So another interesting observation, and it ties into this bigger argument over should we or should we not increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, is that you see there are people who are against increasing the minimum wage, are oftentimes also against maintaining different programs like cash assistance or SNAP or food stamps or things like that, or Obamacare. And that's I'm not really quite sure what to make of that argument, because it's either or. You can't not increase the minimum wage and then also expect that different social safety programs should also be scaled back. If you truly want to get everyone in this country fully participating in the economy, having more purchasing power, being able to purchase the things that they make, for example, or, able to have money to contribute to the economy, then something has to give. You can't do away with social programs and then also have people living on wages that they actually can't live on. If you increase the minimum wage, there is the possibility that you might be able to bump people up out of a certain income bracket, or move them up a level where they might not need to rely so heavily on things like cash assistance or food stamps. I mean, these are things that you have to consider. You have to think about the entire picture when you're making your argument for or against the minimum wage. There are a lot of things at play here. Raising the minimum wage won't solve everything, but it could help to alleviate some of the dependency that people have on other programs or other forms of assistance. So if we look back through American history, and one very interesting historical example can be found in President Lyndon Johnson of the 1960s, his plan and his use of the minimum wage. So when he came into office in '64, and he gave his State of the Union address, he outlaid a plan for a war on poverty. So his whole goal was he wanted to create what he called a great society in the United States, and he wanted to wage an all-out war on poverty. He was trying to, eradicate poverty, but significantly lower the poverty levels to do this. And he had a couple different ways, a couple different weapons, as he called them. One was increasing educational opportunities. Another one was job creation, so actually trying to create jobs for people to get. And the other was income equality or income participation. That's where the minimum wage came in for Johnson. So in 1966, Johnson signs a minimum wage act that increases the minimum wage up to $1.60 an hour. I believe before that it was maybe $1.10, but he increases it to $1.60. And his whole point in doing that, he did not believe that alone was going to end poverty. But if you increase the minimum wage and you also do things to increase the educational opportunities for Americans, so programs like Head Start, which we all know of today, that was part of Johnson's war on poverty. You do that, things like Job Corps, where you try and help individuals get good paying jobs, and then you bring in minimum wage increase into that entire picture. That's how you can use the minimum wage to help lift people up out of poverty. So this is a very good example of how, will raising the minimum wage alone end poverty? No, but if you do that, it's a step that you need that's part of a bigger program for trying to get people to have, full purchasing power and participate fully in the economy. So as a United States historian and also as someone who lives in the United States at this moment, I personally support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It's not a magic cure. It certainly wouldn't make all of our problems go away or definitely level out income inequality. But if you raise it up to $15 an hour, that's more than doubling the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage law that it is right now at $7.25. There are states across the country who have minimum wage laws that are significantly higher than $7.25 an hour, and their economies are not crumbling. So, if you look at some of the arguments for why we shouldn't raise the minimum wage, they're not very well founded. it maybe won't cure all of our problems when it comes to poverty, but it certainly won't hurt, right? There won't be massive job losses because people have to cut corners or cut costs. We actually have really no proof that that has ever really happened. There's never been significant levels of unemployment because of the rise of minimum wage. And it really all comes down to choice. I mean, if you own a business, if you know, Walmart, the corporation of Walmart, we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, that is not going to hurt Walmart. So, I mean, they're not going to suffer because of that. People make arguments that somehow that will have some kind of negative impact. It won't happen. Will the cost of certain products increase? We have some evidence that this won't necessarily happen. I mean, a large majority of the people who work in minimum wage jobs probably work in food service, especially fast food, different corporations. And so there was a study done, I think it was back in maybe the late 90s, about fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so when the minimum wage increased, they wanted to see, okay, so how does this affect unemployment, prices, things of that nature? It had no bearing on unemployment whatsoever. So there weren't significant, unemployment didn't significantly improve in the sense that more people got jobs, but it also didn't increase. You know, there wasn't a spike in unemployment. As far as prices go, I think prices for things like chicken nuggets increased maybe like 0.04%. So it was negligible. It didn't have any sort of massive impact. So taking these different things, personally, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would be a good thing. Again, it wouldn't end everything, but being able to give individuals more purchasing power and also just valuing their jobs more. You know, everyone has a job to do, and even if you don't consider working in fast food a noble occupation, it's still a job. There are people who work in fast food industries or other low-paying jobs because it's the only job that they can get by no fault of their own. We're all sort of victims of this economy that is improving, but it hasn't improved to the level that it was, you know, in the 90s, and we may never get there again. So you hear stories all the time of people graduating with bachelor's degrees and they can't find a job. You know, they have to take whatever job that they can get, and if that means working in fast food, it is what it is. But you know, because of life circumstances that are outside of someone's control, that shouldn't mean that you should make a wage that you can barely live off of. Plus, money that goes into raising the minimum wage, you might potentially be able to ease some of the other costs of safety nets, welfare programs, things of that nature. So personally, I would say raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour might not solve everything, but it wouldn't hurt to give it a try and see what happens. And we have plenty of states around the country who have raised it, and you know, their economies have not crumbled because of that.